Good morning. It's good to be here with you this morning. As Dad mentioned in the beginning, I know that across the country we're seeing some coronavirus spikes. So I know we have some members that are currently in quarantine, some members that are currently positive. So please keep them in your prayers as well as everyone else who is dealing with it. And we just encourage everyone to stay safe. So I've talked about it, I feel like near the beginning of this whole thing, but we have a purpose here, and the longer we can serve that purpose, the better off I think the world is for it. So there is some value in continuing on and being safe. So one thing that I wanted to talk about this morning to start, I know that a lot of things over the last year have been canceled, have been postponed, have been changed. A lot of things that we're used to doing, we haven't been able to do. One thing that I, in particular, enjoy and haven't been able to do is races. There are, I've normally do 2 or 3 5Ks, or Spartan races, or Savage races. I've done some Warrior Dashes. I enjoy them. I'm not saying I'm good at them, or I'm particularly skilled, but I enjoy them. They're fun to me to complete, to be done, to get that medal, to cross that finish line. Sometimes have been good, sometimes have been not so much. But there's one consistent thing that I have with every race I've ever done, and it's I sprint the finish. And I wish Dave or my buddy Ray, who I've done a lot of these with, are here, because they would joke about how, when I see the finish line, I sprint. Like, I'm passing people. You see a lot of people with 5Ks just keep the same pace, and just cruise on through. Not me. I sprint the finish line. And I enjoy that. I like passing people by the end. But it's also, I feel like focusing on the finish line, seeing it right there in front of me, gives me some energy, gives me some motivation to get it done. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that this morning. And we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 12. And there's a race metaphor in here that got me thinking about, that, and maybe it's not a good comparison, but we'll see how it goes. In Hebrews, in the previous chapter, in chapter 11, which we read the end of this morning for the scripture reading, the writer goes through this list. He goes through, historical heroes of faith, kind of like a hall of fame, if you're one to enjoy those sort of things, a hall of fame of faith. And he goes through Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah. He goes through a whole bunch, Moses, Isaac, Joseph. You can go through Rahab. And we started reading, he said, what more shall I say, for time will fail me if I talk about these other ones. If I talk about Gideon, if I talk about Barak, if I talk about Samson, if I talk about these others. Because he goes through each one of these heroes of faith and what their faith accomplished for them and what they did through their faith. So this is the background, and we're going to stay mostly in chapter 12, but I did want to understand what the writer was talking about that leads him to say, because the first word of 12:1 is therefore, right? So that means that because of the previous things, therefore this. So in chapter 12, verse 1, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So he says, therefore, since we have such a cloud of witnesses, there's some books written called Great Cloud of Witnesses. There's a lot of discussion around this particular phrasing, but it is a mention, a nod to all the people he had mentioned before, all those that are in this hall of fame of faith that he had listed in chapter 11. And he's basically imagining, the writer is creating some imagery here, that they are overlooking us. They're looking to our lives, and they're cheering us on. There's this great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, these heroes of faith that he says in verse 39, didn't receive what was promised, but we have. So they're looking what we have and cheering us on. Since we have this great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. So as they're on looking, and he's basically saying, since we have these great examples, since we have these people that have left us these examples of faith, they should be inspired by that. Since we have this, therefore, since we have this great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside, not only because of their example, not only because of all the great things that they have done, that he has mentioned, but the superiority of our position. And in verse, as I mentioned in 39 and 40, they didn't receive what was promised, but we have. In verse 40, because God provided something better for us. We have something better than they have, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. This should lead us, this superiority of our position, these great examples that have led us here, should lead us to remove every obstacle, to remove every sin, lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles. And I read some things about this, about how, and I think this is common sense, how sin so easily entangles us. When you've breaking that wall, when you've broken that seal, when you've done something before, it's easier to do it again. It's easy to get entangled in sin. When you've crossed that line, that line starts to disappear after a while, right? It gets blurry. So the writer says that sin so easily entangles us, we need to be rid of ourselves because of the example and the position that we're in. The audience here, the obstacle that they were dealing with, and I think that's important to understand, was an unwillingness to live by faith in Jesus. These were Jewish Christians. He's speaking to Hebrews, hence the title of the book. And they had an unwillingness to live by faith in Jesus. They still had a dependence on the law. And the writer had talked about for the previous 12 chapters about how we had a superior position, about how we had Jesus as our high priest. We could go directly to God through Jesus by the order of Melchizedek. And I can't talk about Hebrews without mentioning that name. Hopefully Christine is listening. But the writer tells them that they need to shed that obstacle. They need to shed that dependence on the law because faith was always essential. Faith was always important. That's what he's led them up to with this previous chapter of all these people that weren't great because of their adherence to the law. They were great because of their faith in God. I saw an example where this resistance to living by faith, and the example here is running a race, let us run with endurance. The resistance to living by faith was like a runner who never took his warm-up off. He's still being weighed down by the law. He's still being weighed down by an adherence to something that wasn't Christ. And they need to run with endurance, the writer says. And endurance is an important characteristic. James talks about it as being needed to be made perfect in James chapter 2. So continuing on in verse 2 in Hebrews, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down on the right hand of the throne of God. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. There is a translation that says, fixing our eyes only on Jesus. Our focus shouldn't be anywhere else. Our focus isn't on others, either by comparison or as a foundation. Our eyes are fixed only on Jesus. The Greek for this word, fixing our eyes on Jesus, implies looking at something and away from something else. There's a lot more meaning to this word than just looking at Jesus. It means focusing, removing the other things, and looking only at Jesus. If we want to continue using the race metaphor here, Jesus is our helper. He is also our target. He aids us along when we feel weak. He's the pacemaker that helps us go. When you're running a race, it's nice to run with friends, right? Because they kind of can set the pace for you. You can keep up with them. When you're struggling, they can say, come on, we got this. That's what Jesus is for us in this race. And when we fix our eyes on him, when we focus on him and not the surroundings, not others, not the environment that we're in, we can continue on in the race and we can run with the endurance that he calls us to run with. And then the writer here calls Jesus the originator or author and perfecter of the faith. Jesus is more than an example. He's the originator, he's the author, he is the starting point. He's the source. Dave last week talked from from 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter calls him a living stone, a chief cornerstone. And he talked about when you build a building, that's what gets set first. Everything else is built off of that chief cornerstone. Ephesians 2 recalls the same verse that originally comes from Isaiah as well. And it's important to remember that without an originator, things wouldn't exist. I realize that's pretty self-explanatory, but without somebody to start it, you can't build. Without a base, you can't be there. Without my parents, I wouldn't be here. Without Steve Jobs, you wouldn't be able to play on your iPhone and give your kids Candy Crush so they can be distracted while I talk. But without an originator, without a starting point, without an author, something doesn't exist. So our faith is built on that. The faith that these previous Hall of Fame of faith people had didn't have the same as we did because they didn't have Jesus. We do. We have something better. It's the point that the writer is trying to get across here. A lot of times companies, when they're struggling, when their numbers are down, when they're having issues, they'll talk about getting back to basics, getting back to what got us here. How did we start? How did we build? Christians need to continually guide themselves, need to continually reset their focus back to Jesus. And they need to point others back to Jesus. Because there's many other things that will happen. We build off of this. We make traditions. We make customs. We have certain things that we do that were built off of that base. But we need to make sure that continually that focus gets back to Jesus. And we're resetting and we're refocusing and we're readjusting as we get a better understanding of how Jesus wants us to live. Jesus is where our faith needs to come from, and when we do so, when we focus our eyes on him, when we fix our eyes on him, doing so perfects and completes, more appropriately, our faith. Paul talks about this in Philippians 1, verse 6. He says, "For I am confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work among you will complete it by the day of Christ Jesus." Jesus, who started this good work among you, will complete it. He will complete your work. He will complete your faith. We talked about this last week in Bible class, about how Jesus is the completer of our faith. And focusing on Jesus gets us to the finish line. He's our target. He is the completion of our faith. No faith is complete unless it is rooted and originated from Christ. In verse 2, the writer continues, "Who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." The joy set before Jesus was his resurrection and being seated at the right hand. But before that was to occur, he had to endure the cross. But even as he did, he kept his eyes, he fixed his focus on the joy yet to come. If there ever was an example of eyes set on the target, our eyes set on the joy, our eyes set on the finish line, it's Jesus enduring the cross. Jesus finished the race even through the hardship. He even endured the shame. And I think this is an overlooked aspect, an overlooked a stumbling block for people. Because oftentimes, and I won't say oftentimes, there are some times that I feel like we'll do anything for Christ as long as it doesn't embarrass us. People don't like to be embarrassed. People don't like to feel shame, right? That's why they hide away when they feel shame. But Jesus endured the shame. He not only endured the physical torture, the mental torture, the verbal berating, he endured the shame of the cross. This was a thief's death. This was a criminal's death. And he endured that shame with his eyes set on the joy before him, and now has been sat down at the right hand of God. Verse 3, for consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So the writer says, for consider him, consider Jesus, who has endured such hostility. When you're facing struggles, when you're facing trials, when you're facing trouble, consider Jesus, who endured the hostility, the pain, the anguish, the trouble by sinners against himself, so that you will not lose heart, so that you will not grow weary. And I think there's two ways to really look at this. And, I think they're both valid. I think they both happen quite often. There's two ways that we look at this. When we're facing trouble, when we're facing struggles, and somebody comes up and says, well, consider this other struggle, we can feel that they're trying to minimize or dismiss our struggle. You ever had that? Well, I got stung by a bee. Well, I got bit by a rattlesnake. There's that one-upping that occurs. And that's not what Jesus is doing here. And that's not what the writer is intending us to think about. He's not trying to dismiss or minimize our struggle. He's telling us that Jesus is that friend who's been through it before. Jesus is that friend who has endured hardship and is there to tell us that we'll get through it. He's an encourager. He lifts us up. We don't want to, his purpose in this is not to minimize your struggle, to minimize your trouble, but to help you get through it. Jesus faced much worse hostility. And he was focused on what he was there to do. He was focused on the mission. He kept his eyes fixed on the prize, so we fix our eyes on him. And the writer understands that remembering Jesus should help us to not grow weary and to not lose heart. So I believe that the question that needs to be asked when we're really examining the beginning of Hebrews chapter 12 is, who is the originator? Who is the author? Who is the source of our faith? What is our faith based off of? Is it based off of familial traditions? Well, my father went here, my grandfather went here. Is it based off of our friends? Well, our friends believe this, and they're pretty trustworthy. Or is our faith based off of Jesus? Is our faith solely in Jesus? Is there anything that people can do that will harm our faith in Jesus, or is it solid in him? And who completes and perfects our faith? Are we keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus? There's a lot of worldly wisdom out there. There's a lot of figures that want to tell you to look at them. And even Paul, as he was giving himself as an example, imitate me as I imitate Christ. It helps us, and Paul knew this, it helps us to have those mentors, to have those people that we look to for help and guidance. But we're to follow them as they follow Christ. When they don't follow Christ, we don't follow them. There are people that will say, look what I've done for you. Look what I've done for Christianity. Look what I've done for faith in this land. Look at the people that are attracted to me. Look at the people I brought in. But our focus has to remain on Jesus. Our focus has to remain on acting, treating others, living as he would have us do those things. He is the origin, he is the example, he is the Savior, he is the cornerstone. And our faith is built up through him. If you need the prayers of the church this morning, or if you need anything, we encourage you to come forward or reach out as we stand and sing.